I do have the pleasure now to give the floor, as I said, to Mr. John Morrison, the Executive Director of the Institute for Business and Human Rights. Previously, Mr. Morrison directed the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights. This was from 2003 to 2009. He was the head of the Global Campaigns and Community Affairs for the Body Shop International, and also worked for a number of civil society organizations on issues related very closely indeed to refugee protection, migration, and human trafficking. Mr. Morrison, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honour of allowing me to speak to you today. Global supply chains are powerful. They are fundamental to the global economy. And if we accept that there's about $60 trillion in the global economy, then according to UNCTAD, about $6 trillion of this, about 10%, is in intermediate products, i.e. goods that require a global brand or another buyer before being sold into the open market. South-South trade is growing significantly, but South-North trade supply chains are twice as dominant in financial terms still. They are also an increasing important part of the global labour market, with hundreds of millions of workers directly or indirectly involved. Tens of millions of these workers are low-skilled migrants, either within their own country or across international borders. And some of these workers can be vulnerable to exploitation through issues such as debt bondage, fraud, withholding of ID documents, non-payment of wages, and other issues. Business has a critical role to play in the fight against smuggling of migrants, forced labour and trafficking of workers into the formal economy. According to the International Labour Organization, there are nearly 21 million people in forced labour around the world at any given time, over 14 million of these in activities such as agriculture, construction, domestic work and manufacturing. Forced labour and trafficking are crimes punishable under international law, as we know. The growing concern over the rise in numbers of people being trafficked, not only for sexual exploitation but also for labour exploitation, led the international community to adopt the 2000 UN Protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. The protocol supplements the UN Convention against Transnational Organised Crime. In 2014, the ILO Forced Labour Protocol requests that both governments and business engage in due diligence to tackle the issue. While states clearly have the legal duty to protect citizens and prosecute those involved in exploitation and trafficking, I want to turn our attention here to the role of the private sector in this area. What are the responsibilities of companies to respect human rights and combat forced labour and trafficking within their areas of operation and influence? To what extent can companies be deemed to be linked to trafficking offences within their supply chains when they may be very unaware of these activities? In 2011, the United Nations Human Rights Council took an important step forward in clarifying corporate human rights responsibilities when it unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the final product of Professor John Ruggie's 6-year mandate as the UN Secretary-General's Special Representative on Business and Human Rights. Many of you will be familiar with the three-pillar architecture of this: the state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect all human rights, and the need for both states and businesses to ensure access to remedy for victims of corporate-related abuses. With regard to migrant workers and the risks of human trafficking, companies have a responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles to take ongoing due diligence to ensure the risks of exploitation are minimised and access to grievance mechanisms and remedy are in place. From cotton to cocoa, from conflict minerals to fishing, supply chains are often complex and distant. Due diligence is required not only in the sourcing of commodities and components, but also in the sourcing of labour. Do apparel retailers know how the workers in the factories they source from are recruited? Do global hotel chains know how many construction workers building their hotels in cities around the world are working as bonded labourers due to the levels of debt accrued by recruitment fees charged to labour brokers. For the last 20 years, we have seen companies attempt to undertake due diligence and provide remedy at a distance through social auditing. The reliance on audits, often subcontracted, has not done enough to enhance protection for workers or prevent forced labour and trafficking. A new approach by business is needed, with an emphasis on responsible recruitment of migrant workers to combat the risk of bonded and forced labour and trafficking. My colleagues and I at the Institute for Human Rights in Business have been working with partners including the International Labour Organization and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to focus on the role of third-party labour providers in many global supply chains. These labour providers can provide a very valuable service, but sometimes some of them can pose a significant risk to worker welfare and possible exploitation due to a range of all too common practices, including excessive fees charged to workers, the retention of ID documents, and the lack of transparency around contracts. We are working to promote ethical recruitment, whereby companies require their suppliers to use registered labour brokers only and to pay the recruitment costs instead of the workers paying those fees and thereby accruing onerous levels of debt. In 2011, we launched the DAC Principles for Migration with Dignity, and there are copies of this, I believe, at the back of the room, with the support of the leading global companies and trade unions and in the presence of the government of Bangladesh. The DAC Principles for Migration and Dignity rest on two foundational principles. First, that all workers are treated equally and without discrimination, and the second is that all workers enjoy the protection of employment law. Following these broad statements, the DAC Principles are made up of 10 implementation steps, and I will just list them. I don't have time to actually go into any detail. First, that no fees are charged to workers. It's employers that should bear the full costs of recruitment. Second, number 2, all worker contracts are clear and transparent and available in the worker's language. Number 3, policy and procedures are inclusive. Number 4, no workers' passports or identity documents are retained. Number 5, wages are paid regularly, directly and on time. Number 6, the worker has the right to be represented. On that point, collective agreements across entire sectors are key to transforming workplace standards and avoiding business risk and helping to deliver respect for rights, including human rights. Number 7, working conditions are safe and decent. Number 8, living conditions are also safe and decent. Number 9, access to remedy is provided. Migrant workers should have access to judicial remedy and to credible grievance mechanisms without fear of recrimination or dismissal. And number 10, freedom to change employer is respected and safe, timely return is guaranteed. Now, you might think that I'm just sitting here as a think tank with a wish list of 10 issues that are far removed from the reality of what businesses are willing to commit to. But we have a large number of companies supporting our work, and the good news is that a small number of them, of leading global companies, have already introduced policy on no worker fees, such as Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Coca-Cola. Others include policies on non-retention of worker passports. With bold corporate leadership, this can become an industry norm. Coupled with strong legislation and enforcement by governments requiring companies to register labour brokers, these would be very significant steps to reduce the risk of forced labour and trafficking in supply chains. Governments are taking steps to require companies to report on how they address the risk of forced labour and trafficking in their supply chains. 2 examples. One in the USA, the executive order to prevent trafficking in federal contracts, and more recently in my own country, the United Kingdom, the Modern Day Slavery Act, which has just become law, are 2 such examples at levelling the playing field. In relation to the second, the British Retail Consortium and a collection of leading UK businesses, including a number of leading supermarkets and retailers, made a submission to the UK government regarding the Modern Day Slavery Bill as it passed through Parliament. In it they stated, "We would like to see a clause in the bill that calls for transparency in supply chains. We believe that smart legislation that requires all companies to be transparent about the steps they are taking to address modern-day slavery and child labour in their supply chains can drive stronger and broader efforts to end exploitation and the abuse of workers. They went on to say, "We know we can and must continue to do more to prevent modern slavery, and the media and public demand that we do this. But we can do so much more where clear regulation is in place." So finally, Chair, the strength of effective state regulation and enforcement to protect human rights, along with collective actions and human rights leadership by responsible companies and adequate access to remedy, are all essential elements in tackling the rising tide of trafficking that we see in so many places. As the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe has already stated, states themselves are powerful economic actors, and the same 10 steps can be taken to ensure that public procurement is also free from any linkage to trafficking or forced labour. We at the Institute for Human Rights in Business stand ready to work with all of you to combat human trafficking and protecting the rights of all migrant workers around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. You have brought in the issue of the global supply chains, the risk that follows global supply chains of labor exploitation, and thereby also the importance of the role of the private sector in taking steps. You have mentioned the importance of responsible recruitment or ethical recruitment of migrant workers, various names, essentially the same idea. You mentioned the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which take up the issues of protection, respect for human rights, assurance of access to remedies, and you very quickly were able to go through the DAC Principles for Migration with Dignity, with their 2 broad principles and the 10 implementation steps. As you have mentioned, this is, or a handout of this is available there at the back of the room. And you ended up with excellent examples of what kind of legislative measures could be taken. I was struck by the fact that the United Kingdom now has a Modern Slavery Act that almost brings a déjà vu feeling to the 1800s when England was the first to actually take international action or to lead international action against slavery, and now there is a need to deal with modern slavery. It is sad, but it is good that there are countries out there that are taking measures. So thank you very much for these examples.